Hey guys, what's going on? This is Fred2266 here, back to finish off Swayback Mountain. Now I'm going to be reading chapter 2. A little bit longer, probably will be 2 parts, but oh well. Remember, it's the Jack ship, based off the movie Brokeback Mountain, so yeah. But then Rarity groaned, so soft, Applejack thought she must have imagined it. Rarity? She brought her face close and nuzzled the unicorn pony's cheek. Rarity groaned louder and started to cough, and water suddenly dribbled from between her lips. Applejack quickly turned her onto her side and held her as wave after wave of river water poured out of her mouth. "Oh, thanks, Celestia," said Applejack, patting Rarity on her back to help dislodge the last of the water she had breathed in. "You're breathing again. You're okay." Applejack's top lip quivered. "For a moment there I thought I'd lost you," she whispered. Rarity looked up at Applejack groggily. The unicorn pony's beautiful indigo mane, wet and tangled, was plastered to her face and neck, and her coat was caked in mud and river weeds. It broke Applejack's heart to see Rarity in such a state, but then the unicorn pony smiled at her. "Darling," she whispered, "there's no way I could go anywhere looking like this." "Does it hurt anywhere, Rarity?" Applejack asked in concern. "Do you need anything?" Rarity looked up at her friend and whispered, "Do you have a mirror?" And then Applejack at last allowed herself to burst into tears. With Rarity too weak to help it took a long time for Applejack to set up the tent. Most of the pegs were lying on the bottom of the river, so she was forced to collect heavy river rocks and roll them onto the edges of the terraplane to keep the material in place. The wind was growing wilder with every passing moment, tearing at the tent and threatening to blow it into the air. From the dryness of the nook under the outcropping, Rarity watched Applejack struggling in the sun. Applejack had wrapped her up in all that was left of the outfit she brought with her. The rest were floating downstream somewhere, never to be seen or admired by any pony ever again. The outer layer of Rarity's warm cocoon was the exquisitely sequined party dress she'd brought with her in case there was some kind of social event after the rodeo. She chuckled grimly. If only the gentle coats of Cold Springs could see her now! The muddy river water had got into her saddlebags and ruined it. Half the sequins were missing, and it was stained with mud beyond repair. In a few moments the gorgeous creation she had been so proud of, gazing on it as it glistened on its dressmaker doll in the boutique, had become little more than a filthy rag. Rarity held back tears. All those days of hard work, sewing each individual sequin on in its perfectly straight lines, wasted. In her weakened state, Rarity felt absolutely useless. She tried to get up and help Applejack earlier. It was too much for her to stand, watching dear pony working so stoically, so selflessly, in that cold dark maelstrom of wind and rain. But a sudden wave of weakness had set her entire body trembling, and she slumped back into the ground. Applejack had galloped up to her, her eyes furious, berating her. "You try and move one more time, little missy, and I'll come and roll some rocks on top of you as well." Rarity lowered her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Applejack. I just feel so terrible that I can't be of any assistance to you, darling," she sniffled. "And all this is my fault. If only I'd been more careful deciding where to put these big clumsy hooves of mine." "Now don't you worry about yourself about that, Rarity," Applejack had replied. The unicorn pony's distress had touched her. "It was just an accident, is all. It could have happened to any pony." "It wouldn't have happened to you," Rarity replied, softly so that Applejack couldn't hear her as she walked back to the rain. "You always know the right thing to do." Applejack rolled the final rock into place. "There!" she said in triumph. Even wearing her oilskin coat and hat, she was sopping wet, and she took herself over to a corner of the nook away from where Rarity was sitting, and shook herself dry. "Now let's get out of this wind and get warmed up." Rarity nodded. Even wrapped in so many layers, the wind was cutting into her, and her bones ached and her teeth chattered with the cold. The two ponies crawled under the tent flap and into the dry, dark warmth inside. It was still daylight, with the black clouds of the storm blocking out the sun. It was as if the middle of the night inside the tent. Applejack flicked on a torch with her mouth, and placed it in a corner of the tent. Its pale yellow light made huge shadows of the two ponies against one side of the tent, and Rarity's eyes suddenly lit up in delight when she saw them. "Even wrapped in rags, I have such a silhouette," she beamed, striking a pose. "And Applejack! Just look at you!" She pointed at Applejack's silhouette magnified on the tent of the wall. "You know, my dear, your cowboy hat really is so charming. Its wide brim is simply the perfect accessory for your ponytail. It balances it so well." Applejack lay down, exhausted, and watched Rarity as she tried different glamorous poses, her silhouette mirroring them. She was tired, and part of her was still angry at the unicorn pony. but as she looked at her own shadow, wearing her Pappy's cowboy hat, the memory of Rarity leaping to the river to save it without hesitation made the anger melt away as quickly as it had come. Applejack closed her eyes for a moment, and without realizing it, dozed off. When she opened her eyes again, she saw that Rarity was curled up beside her, fast asleep. The unicorn pony had earlier washed the mud off and weeds off herself as best she could with rainwater, but her coat was still smudged with dirt and her mane was all clumped together in places. Applejack smiled at her sleeping face, the heavy eyelashes fluttering slightly as she dreamed, and she licked the unicorn pony's wet cheek. Even after all their adventures today, Rarity still looked so beautiful. Applejack sighed and cuddled against her for warmth. And just how in tarnation can you still smell so sweet after sliding down a mountain, side and wading down river mud? You smell just like you left one of those fancy spas, she chuckled. Like flowers and soap and sandalwood all bundled up together. Unicorn magic. Must be. As the rain continued to patter and hiss outside, and the thunder rolled and growled, Applejack fell asleep as well. When Applejack awoke, the light inside the tent was the dull gray of early dawn. Those Pegasus ponies must have finally got their act together, she thought in relief. The first event of the rodeo was scheduled for the early afternoon, and with a bit of luck and some determined hiking, they'd be able to get to Cold Springs in time. She looked down at Rarity, swaddled in her layers of clothes like a baby. She was still fast asleep. Applejack snorted in annoyance. Come on, Rarity. It's not like you need any beauty sleep. She nudged the unicorn pony with a gentle hoof. Time to rise and shine. If you don't get up, we won't have any time to find those berries you're after. Rarity moaned a little, but she still didn't wake up. Applejack frowned and came closer. Rarity's face was pale, and the area around her horn was covered in sweat. You okay, Rarity? Applejack placed a hoof on the unicorn pony's forehead. She was burning up. Applejack straight away started to peel the layers of water-stained clothes, pulling them off Rarity with her teeth. It was just like unwrapping a mummy, but that image didn't seem all too funny. At all funny to Applejack at that moment. She'd seen the terrible things that could happen with a high fever. She remembered her Pappy, and those long last days, confined to his bed, sweet apple acres. He looked just like Rarity did now, pale and sweaty, and so weak. Her Pappy had always been such a huge and robust stallion. Big Macintosh was a spinning image of how he looked in his younger days, dragging his plow out in the fields in the broiling sun, the sweat of the heat and the labor beading on his flanks and withers. Applejack remembered how she used to skip behind him, planting the apple seeds from her little saddlebags, and all the while he pulled the plow and looked back at his daughter now and then with pride and love in his dark eyes. And when he'd fallen ill, the weight and muscle had fallen away from his frame, and he'd become so thin and fragile that Applejack and Big Macintosh had to help him get into bed, and he'd felt no heavier than a single bushel of apples. Don't worry, sis. Little sis, Big Macintosh had told her one afternoon as she had been crying on the porch of the homestead, as so often she had been in those terrible days. Pappy'll be fine. He just needs to get his strength back. Yep. But Applejack had seen a tiny glimmer of doubt in her big brother's eyes, and she'd known at that moment that their Pappy wasn't ever going to get better. Rarity was unclothed now, lying on her side, her chest rising slowly as she breathed shallowly and with difficulty. Applejack nuzzled her, but she didn't respond. Tears welled up in the corner of Applejack's eyes, but she angrily shook them away. What you doin', you dumb rabbit? Crying like a filly that stubbed her hoof. She rifled for her saddlebags, finally finding the water canister. She opened it and put it next to Rarity's mouth, but the unicorn pony didn't react, so she gently eased her head up and let some of the water trickle down to her mouth. Rarity coughed, but after a while she started to swallow. That's a good filly, said Applejack. Jack? Rarity opened her eyes and looked at her friend. Her pupils were in focus, and she seemed half asleep still. Applejack's here, Rarity, replied Applejack. She sighed in relief. Don't you worry. Applejack, Now don't you try to talk, Rarity. You got an awful high fever. You need to rest up, else. She tipped a little remaining water into the canister in Rarity's mouth, and she drank it. Rarity coughed again. So thirsty. Applejack. Applejack nodded. Course you are, she replied. You're awful dehydrated. She stood up and went to the flap of the tent. Just you wait a short while. I'll be back soon. Just gotta go find some fresh water. The morning light was clear and crisp, and the air fresh as Applejack followed the river a little way upstream. Thankfully, she didn't have to travel far to find water. She knew there was a little spring somewhere in the rocky face of the ridge as it twisted away from the river and back into the foothills. Her Pappy had been the one who'd first shown it to her, all those years ago, when she'd make the journey to Cold Springs to watch her first rodeo of him. My little apple bucker, you got a real talent with a lasso, he told her as they traveled through the Swayback Mountains together. She'd been around Apple Bloom's age at that time, and she was riding on her pappy's back, since her own short legs had become tired from walking. I seen you snare a rabbit from 15 feet away. That's no mean accomplishment for a little filly. I told him I was sorry, Applejack had sniffed. Her pappy had laughed a great, rolling laugh that had echoed through the mountains. Applejack, that big old heart of yours is 10 sizes too big for that little body of yours, he smiled at her. One day, you're going to be something great. Applejack was so deep in reminiscence that she realized she'd already passed the spot. She doubled back a short way and at last found the spring. She nudged the canister into place under the trickle of glittering water and watched it slowly fill. I'm sorry, Pappy, she whispered. I trained so hard the whole year. I was sure this season I was going to do your memory proud. Before he became an apple farmer, her pappy had been a rodeo star. He'd been a famous name among the plains ponies for years, but had finally given it away to start a family. But one day Applejack had found his old lasso in a box up in the hayloft, and started practicing with it during break times on the farm in secret. She'd gotten away with it for about a month before a pappy had stumbled upon her, trying to pull the lasso off a tree branch she snared. She thought he'd be angry, but he just watched her and smiled, a blade of grass in his mouth, till she finally got loose. I always thought it'd be Big Macintosh that inherited the spark, he explained, taking the lasso from her and showing her how to hold it correctly, loose and lightly. But it seems that old saying ain't wrong after all. It's sometimes the littlest apple seed that grows into the tallest tree. The canister was so overflowing, so Applejack capped it and picked it up in her mouth. A sudden feeling of loss and disappointment welled up in her. She realized that there was no way that she'd be able to make the rodeo now. All those months of practice had all been for nothing, and all those dreams of honoring her pappy's name. All because of that puffed-up unicorn pony. She galloped back to the tent, and angrily pushed her way inside through the flap. I got your water, Rarity, she said. Are you feeling any better now? Rarity lifted her head. Little, she managed to say. Applejack brought the canister to her lips, and this time Rarity was able to drink from it herself. Rarity had watched Applejack as she drank. The earth pony had turned her back on her, and was busy packing up her salad bag. What's the matter, darling? She asked. The realization dawned on her head, and she said, Oh. Oh? Oh! Applejack turned on her angrily. Is that all you have to say for yourself? Oh! Rarity's face fell at the angry onslaught. Darling, I'm so sorry. So frightfully, terribly sorry. You won't be able to make the rodeo now, will you? She couldn't look at Applejack's incriminating eyes any longer, and she stared at the floor of the tent. And it's all my fault, isn't it? She whispered. All of it, Applejack nodded. Now just lay there and rest yourself while I go get everything packed up. We should be able to get back to Ponyville before sundown. Rarity got up unsteadily. Don't worry about me, Applejack, she said, starting to gather up her own clothes. I'll be perfectly able to travel back to Ponyville on my own. You should go into the rodeo yourself. You'll surely make it without me slowing you down. Applejack shook her head. You're still much too sick, she said. There's no way you can make it back without my help. Applejack turned back to her packing, and Rarity watched her, crestfallen. The terrible feeling of guilt in her heart was worse than the fever and the ache in her limbs as she lay back down. But as Applejack was busy stuffing her oilskin coat into her saddle bag, Rarity suddenly stepped forward and knocked over the water canister, its contents flowing all over the floor of the tent. Oops, she said. She looked at Applejack fearfully, but the earth pony said nothing. She just stopped in the middle of her packing, walked over to Rarity in silence, and picked up the canister in her mouth. Applejack was seething as she left the tent. It was almost as if Rarity had spilled the water on purpose. But what did it matter now, anyway? She stoically galloped back to the spring and refilled the canister, and in a short while she returned to the tent. As she pushed open the flap, she said, Now don't spill this one, you hear? But then she noticed that the tent was empty, except for her own half-packed saddlebags. Rarity and all her belongings were gone. Oh my God! So this isn't 2 parts, I guess, because the first part had the explanation of what I was reading and all that nonsense. Yet there's one more chapter, and I guess they'll kiss or something. I don't know. Something's gonna happen. They've cuddled and licked cheeks, and now they're gonna kiss. So stay tuned for that. That's sure to be something.